Good afternoon. So after a very um, stimulating, I think, first session with Professor Reutman and Professor Johnstone's presentations, I hope you had a good lunch. And so I'm going to talk about a few things, and some of it is probably very obvious to you, and it's not necessarily going to be something very new, even the images and all. But what I'm going to try to emphasize is what is the importance of spatial planning and how spatial planning has been very useful in many ways and at the same time has been very problematic. So and when you go, so this was talking about spatial transformations, right? In this But it may be planned or unplanned. So like when you go and look at the communities and the cases that you'll see, what things to bear in mind in a way, right? So let's get started. So it's actually quite a lot of pictures. And the way I've set it up, if was I presume I'm going to give another lecture, I think Monday, right? So I'll maybe include something. If I don't finish, I can use some of the things later. So I've set it up in that way, right? Anyway, so what is urbanization, right? Okay, anyone? Let's see with the S. Satu students, what is urbanization? No right or wrong answer. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. I think you said it. And the one thing you didn't mention is probably also the economic transition, right? The economic systems are very distinct. You mentioned all the other ones. Spatially, it looks different. Physically, it looks different. Social and cultural, aspects begin to change. So all of these are urbanization, right? And in general, it's a concept which is more sort of, so depending on what the economy, nature of the economy is and how, society and sort of the other systems function in that space, you would call it urban, and if there is a given geographical sort of an entity, for example, a country or a province or a district, right? And you hear about this thing called the level of urbanization, which is very important, right? Level of urbanization is what proportion, what percentage of the population of that geographical entity. You can apply it to anything. The continent, Asia is this percent urbanized, Indonesia is so much percent, urbanized that way. And then that gives you an estimate of like, uh, because urbanization is correlated with a lot of other development indicators, right? With income, for example, generally cities and urban areas have higher incomes, right? They also tend to have better services. So you tend to find higher levels of literacy, higher levels of better levels of healthcare, and all these things in urbanized areas. You're also likely to find some more harmful impacts, right? So it will probably more despoilation of the environment and more sort of ecological imbalances, etc., are also probably evident, right? More pollution, all those kinds of things. So it's a mixed bag, but generally urbanization has been pretty good for sort of humans in general, because it has helped overcome a lot of afflictions, etc. And that is all related to the innovation and the creativity and the money that flows. Yeah. But like I said, there are downsides to it. It has been pretty bad for the environment, for indigenous cultures, and because those things get erased. Even like sort of it, you call it as an, it's a melting pot, which is a good thing, but that can also be a euphemism sometimes for the erasure of culture and memory and things like that, right? So anyway, so it's a very interesting, set of challenges that we have in cities, and so it depends on how well we manage it in a way, right? So that's the thing. Okay, so as you can see, this is so today most people in the world live in so 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 very briefly, I won't go into the details, but like I said, there's a very strong correlation between development indicators, but development defined as sort of economic development and maybe technological development as well as improved services, etc. Right? So globally, um, we see this correlation almost in every country. Every country shows this. Like as it becomes more urbanized, there is more sort of development and or sort of the indicators become better in that way, particularly the economic and the development indicators. But like I said, there are some exceptions, but we won't go into the exception, but they're very rare, small exceptions, right? Where you find maybe large levels of, high levels of urbanization and yet very low levels of development. There are some pockets like that in the world, but mostly it is like this, right? So uh, this is, I mean, most recently, like in the last few years or so, this is what it looks like. So the blue regions that you see are still, the ones that are not urbanized. This means, so this is a majority rural or majority urban, right? Everyone clear on the word majority? What does that mean? Exactly, right. So all these blue regions are yet not over 50% urbanized. They might have very big cities, but overall the population. So, so this South Asia is very interesting, right? So India has got some of the largest cities in the world, population-wise now, right? And yet the country is not very urbanized, which you can then imagine that there are many urban centers probably, right? And there are many people still living in rural areas, and sort of associated with economies and livelihoods which are not urban in a way, right? So agriculture, mining, fishing, whatever, the primary sector activities, right? So it's interesting. So here you see, this is here, Indonesia. This one turned this brown maroon not too long ago, maybe about 10, 12 years ago, whatever. Somebody says about 2010, 11, 12, whatever, around 9, 10, 11, 12. Anyway, so today it is majority, right? China crossed that limit also some time back, right? And probably, South Asia, at least the bigger countries like Bangladesh and, will take another maybe 15, 20 years to maybe reach that stage, whatever, right? So, but here, as you can see, almost all of the Americas are, of course, urbanized. And also, like I said, the correlation between development is very clear, right? So in most of the developed countries, you find almost, it's safe to say about 80% urbanization. So 80% of the population of developed countries probably lives in cities, because with technology and all, you don't need as many people working in the primary sector activities. They are there. They're very big earners also many times, but they are not sort of labor intensive, right? So then people then start working in cities and this kind of thing. So the reason I'm mentioning is that all these things is because with the nature of the economy, as it changes the economic system, it also influences the spatial makeup and the spatial sort of arrangement of cities in a way, right? So this is why it's important to understand this thing a little more. So this is an aberration here. So South America, just to give you some background, South America has always been kind of more urbanized than the rest of the developing world. So most of the countries in like South America are still kind of considered to be developing countries or part of the global South. Yet, as you can see, it's almost majority urbanized, yeah, except maybe very just that one little country or pocket up there. I think that's probably Suriname, I guess, or whatever that is, maybe French. Suriname, I think that's Suriname, yeah. Right. So anyway, so the point is that, so why is that? Because the population of South American countries is not very big, first of all, right, compared to Africa and Asia, right? And most of that urban population, or most of the population resides in like one or two very large cities, often one large city. It's called a primate city sometimes, right? When it is much larger than the second largest city, right? So anyways, this is just to give you a background of this, right? Okay. Again, this is simple. You might have seen these things and read it in your class, right? So the point I wanted to mention here is also that, today, how much is the population of the world today approximately? Yeah, so we are, oh, sorry. Hey, sorry. No. Yeah, we are about here somewhere, right? Somewhere here, in this range. So whatever. So it's expected it'll go to 9 billion. But notice it's not going to like 12 or 13 billion. Why? And because by then, as it's rising, you're also, as this is going up, most of the countries in the world are also becoming more and more urbanized. That means the development indicators are improving. As that happens, population rates will start declining, right? So it's not an endless process, right? Now, it's interesting that, say, about 50 years ago, there was a lot of concern at one point. There were scientists, with all their scientific research predicting, these are population scientists and demographers and ecologists. They thought that the world could not sustain a population more than, that was the carrying capacity concept, right? More than 6 billion people. But today we have already more than 8 billion and will reach even more. So the reason being, there were some factors which we had not accounted for. We had not seen how science and technology will progress, and how that would change things, right? So again, it's not necessarily all good. It's also bad in the sense that there was also this concern that we'll run out of fossil fuels and what's going to happen then. But we are discovering new and new reserves, newer and newer reserves, because now we have better technology, and we have the better technology to extract those things also. Now we can go like miles deep into the ocean floor. Not necessarily a good thing, but we have access to resources, right? Similarly, natural gas has been found in huge quantities. So, the point is that you can't necessarily predict everything, but you can see from the trends, right? But the thing which seems more certain is that as cities will and countries will become more urbanized and developed, their population rates will go down. So a lot of the crazy things that some countries try to do, which is like forced population control and all, like, the famous one child and two child policy in China, as well as like much more draconian kind of family planning, I mean, programs in many other sort of developing countries, those things are not needed. So today we have enough research evidence to show that if we focus on just, I mean, development and education and economic development, these things will automatically be taken care of, right? Anyway, so interrupt me anytime. So anyway, so basically, in your lifetime, we are already living in a very urbanized, and you know you will see much more urbanization happen during this lifetime, right? Anyway, so some people say that it was in 2009 when the world's, I mean, urbanization rate, I mean, or rate of, I mean, level of urbanization exceeded that of the rural population, right? So we've been coming up. Again, this is very interesting, right? So these are share of the population living in urbanized areas, right? So as you can see here, so countries like, say, India and China, Mexico, but then we are getting into sort of South America, so slightly different, I told you, right? But if you look at these two, so here, so it is much later that their population start. And so broadly after the 50, I mean, the 1950s, basically, that the populations start rising, right? So China's starts rising here. And then around, let's say, the 1970s, after the 1970s, start shooting up really fast. 80s, 90s, that's when the Chinese development happens. China's slower, India's slower than that to catch on, but it's also catching on like this, right? So the more developed countries started going up first, right? But now you'll see that once you reach this, most of them start dipping these. As you become more urbanized, then your rate of population growth and all of this urbanization will start slowing down in a way, right? So this is what it looks like around the world. So continent-wise, I mean, just if you see, so like I said, North America and South America are probably the most urbanized continents, and then as you can see, Africa is still the least, and Asia is about 50%, but most of Asia is being held back, I mean, or has a lower rate of urbanization, primarily because of South Asia, because it has got some really big countries which are still very rural, right? That's predominantly India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, right? Like that. Okay. So anyway, so now this is something also very, yes, Lahela. I'm not very sure. It probably does. It probably does include that, but again, it's interesting because different agencies look at it differently, define things differently. So sometimes, for example, in some UN or World Bank publications, East Asia includes Southeast Asia. Whereas generally, I mean, from a geography or, I mean, sort of geopolitical standpoint, you would not consider Southeast Asia as part of East Asia, So sometimes it's East Asia and the Pacific. So it depends on how they define it. Yeah. But the thing is, it doesn't make much of a difference to the overall, because the population of the Pacific Islands is quite small. The levels of urbanization are very high. So Pacific Islands are urbanized pretty much, most of them, right? I mean, there might be just very few exceptions which are not, maybe some small islands, but overall, yes, because today they are predominantly, I mean, and their rates of urbanization have actually accelerated quite a bit in the last 20 years. Yeah, that's something. Anyway, so this is very interesting. So what I want you to notice here is these are just, I mean, like over the years, where, I mean, what kind, I mean, this is another, so there are many different ways in which you can classify and categorize cities by size, etc. You can define things. So you probably heard these words called like mega city, metropolis, right? So what's a metropolis? Again, there's no hard and fast definition, but it's a well accepted definition, more or less, right? What's a metropolis? Very good. What's a mega city? More than 10 million, right? So since we haven't really gone past like 3 times that figure yet, so I mean, Jakarta, Mexico City, New Delhi, these are all like really big in the conglomerates. It's still not really about 30 million, right? Maybe we'll need a new name. So you should start thinking maybe, you know, some of you, by the time you start practicing as planners or something, or researchers, whatever, you might coin a new name, because we'll have probably gigantic cities by then. Yeah, I mean, it's possible, right? Anyway, so the point here is, what is interesting is that, see, this is interesting, right? So these are the mega cities, right? So mega cities, of course, very big, like I said. In many countries, most of the urban population, so Jakarta is a mega city, right? So like a rule of thumb definition is, if it's more than twice the size of the next biggest city, you can consider it to be a primate city, right? Definitely if it's 3 times more, in a way, right? Again, nothing so set in stone, but that's a good sort of a heuristic, a rule of thumb to use, right? So Surabaya is probably just, I mean, about officially some 3 million something today. And maybe the metropolitan region is about 5 million. So it's still way smaller, 5 times smaller or more, than Jakarta. Yeah.
When you're using the number of people living in these quote unquote cities, are you counting entire metropolitan?
It could be, again, defined the way they define it. Yeah. So it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't matter. So they are all from different agencies, right? So yeah, so it's a good question, but I mean, it depends on how sometimes they will define in this fine print that, yeah, we include the metropolitan region, or we don't include the my guess is yes, they do use the metropolitan region even there, right? So the interesting thing here is, though, what I wanted to point out is, as you can see, most people are not actually residing in the mega cities. This is the interesting part, right? This dark green color are the mid-sized cities. So the mid-sized cities have, since 1990, more than doubled. See this? The mega cities, of course, grown, of course, right? But there is a significant number here, right? And so that is interesting. So a lot of the development now, urbanization in many countries, especially larger countries, is happening in sort of the second tier and the third tier cities. It's also true of Indonesia. You see a lot of, in the smaller islands and all, the urban centers growing really rapidly, in a way, right? So anyway, so why is this important? Because it is important from the spatial transformation and the spatial planning responses that are required, right? How you would deal with a small city that is growing rapidly is much more different than how you deal with like a mammoth, sort of a gigantic city, right? Which is already kind of bursting at the seams, and not enough planning has been done, in a way, right? So this is why it's important to think of them also spatially, right? And how they're. So anyway, so this is a generic sort of a thing. So this is about urbanization level, right? So in the beginning, when cities are, I mean, a country is growing and the cities. So this is basically urbanization. The urbanization level cannot be about a city, correct? A city is 100% urbanized. That's why you call it a city, right? So, sometimes people use the word like a urban city or a rural village. Those are oxymorons in a way, right? Because city is urban and the village is mostly rural, in a way, right? But the city, the word city is, it's 100%, sort of, it might have some pockets of sort of spaces which look a little different, but yet it is in an urban system. It's 100% urbanized, right? So it usually refers to something like a district, a county, a province, a state, some other administrative or geographical entity, right, within that. So generally, I mean, for a country, this is talking about countries, right? In the beginning, it's slow. Then it picks up. Okay. So this correlates with levels of development, levels of income, levels of literacy, healthcare, gender participation in the labor force, a lot of these human development indicators, right? This sort. So if you plot those other graphs, they will kind of show a similar trajectory. They may not be identical, because the exact rates and all might be different, but it will be like this is like also something called like a gentle S curve kind of thing, right? So once it reaches this point, then it starts stabilization, then it starts slowing down. Because you cannot go beyond 100% urbanization, right? So once you start hitting 80, you'll start, and it's almost like in sort of calculus and all, right? It's like till infinity it can keep going, because actually it will probably never be urban, right? Maybe there are some exceptions. Say Singapore, it's a city state, right? But for most other countries, there'll be some people at least left in the rural or the primary sector doing some things, right? So not everything can ever be urban, right? Or the other way around in a way, right? There were also cities in the ancient times, right? I mean, even thousands of years ago, we found. Anyway, so this is also important. So this is something you've probably done in your courses, as if you are in planning. If you're not in planning, then this is how sort of population projections are done, right? So this thing is called a population pyramid, right? Now, so this is about the global pyramid. This is the global population. Let me just, how many are familiar with this? Some of you are, some of you are not. Okay. So generally what this is, so the blue side is like the male population. Anything. It could be the city of Samarang. It could be Central Java. It could be Indonesia, whatever you pick, right? Any entity. And this side is the female population, right? These bars are basically your, they are called age cohorts, right? So it's like a 5-year interval. So this one shows how many, the lowest one, how many people are there in the age group 0 to 5. So children under 5 years, then 5 to 10. So you keep going like this, right? So what it shows is, so the more you have, that means more number. Okay. The higher you have, that means more longevity, right? So this immediately tells you what kind of thing. So generally, most developing countries have things like this, like a pyramid. That's why it's called a pyramid. So that means there are lots of younger people. Many babies are born, many die at childbirth, some don't. I mean, for a poor developing country, for example, right? And then some survive, many don't survive, kind of thing, for various other reasons, healthcare, etc. Not many people live, say, beyond 50, 60. So if you look at a developing country's pyramid, for example, from 50 years ago, you will find that today's pyramid is taller because now people live longer, right? That kind of thing, right? So as countries become more developed, so in that middle stage or something, right? Or approximately speaking, right? Then you see that this number starts shrinking. So as societies become more developed, that means women are also getting more literate, they're working, whatever, they're having fewer babies, it becomes more expensive, cost of living goes up, healthcare improves and all of this. So many factors, I mean, so fertility rate starts dropping. So you have fewer people in this age group. Get it? And more people start living here, and this overall pyramid starts to go up. So in the past, I mean, 50 years ago, in most developing countries, people probably didn't live beyond 60, 50, a lot of people. But today they live to 70, 75. In the developed countries, pretty much most people live, until about 80, In some countries, they live like way past 90 also, So anyway, so this is interesting. But as you can see, the middle part becomes bulkier, expanded, right? Now, this is important because somewhere between this part, in this part, how big this part is determines how much revenue a country has, because that is the working age group, the productive age group. So because when people are working, their incomes are taxed, they buy stuff, they invest in stuff, so everything is taxed, right? So if they are richer, they have more wealth, they can invest in property, whatever. So all of these things, so that's the productive age. Children are not working, elderly people are also not working because they retire, right? So this is very important, this age group. So as this country starts to develop, this part starts bulking up, right? But then it becomes slowing down because fewer kids are being born, right? So this base starts shrinking. So that means you have shrink smaller. So this is interesting because at this stage, when you have more surplus, funds, etc., the country starts investing in things like various kinds of welfare programs. So then you get like free education, free healthcare, like you have your BPJS card, your health insurance card. That can only be done if the country has enough money. So countries have enough money if this. So But so it becomes a very interesting conundrum. This is also to do with cities, how you maintain cities, etc. Right? Where is the revenue coming from? You've provided more services, more infrastructure that has to be kept up, maintained, right? So where is the revenue going to come from, right? So it becomes an interesting challenge that as populations shrink, I mean, or the demographic sort of cohorts start becoming smaller, you actually have less revenue, but you are already spending more in a way. So that becomes a very interesting conundrum in the development trajectory of a country, right? Anyway, so so this is the world population, right? This is interesting. So the light gray, this one, was what the world population pyramid looked in 1950. Okay. This darker blue around it was what it looked in 2010. Okay. In 2050, it is expected to become like this. And by 2100, it will become even broader, right? So you see what is happening, right? Interestingly, this is actually going to shrink. See this one, the base. So, but this part is going to significantly expand and people are going to live longer, right? So this is way up in the 90s. People are well living into the 90s here. There's some people living beyond 100 here, right? So anyone, so today the retirement age in most countries is about 60 something, whatever, let's say late 50s, 60, 62. So everyone beyond this stage basically is not going to be working. They'll retire more or less, right? So countries are either trying to push the retirement age higher so that they can have people working longer. Anyway, so this, you understand the point, right? So this is an interesting concept to understand, right? So as cities, so why I'm saying this is that you have to think of it in two ways, that as cities will develop, you don't have to worry too much, because if you make cities develop the right way, populations will decline eventually. You don't have to worry about, oh, today it's 15 million, so 30 years, 40 years from now, we might be left with like 45 million people. No, probably not, right? It's going to slow down. At the same time, you also have to think from sustainability standpoints, right? From the economic sustainability standpoint, how are these cities going to be, so this is interesting. So any idea how cities deal with this when they reach that challenge? That there are fewer people who are actually contributing to the economy, more people who are dependent on the welfare services. So how do we make that balance? What happens in that case? Yes, Jake.
I'm just curious, I know that like places like Rome and birth rates are below.
Replacement rate, yeah.
Yeah, is that correlated this at all?
Yeah. So I'll show you Japan in a bit. Yeah. So so what happens if, like, Japan, Rome, whatever, it can be anybody. It's Scandinavia. No, but how do they keep the system going if this is, yes?
What I know is Japan import working class.
Yes, it's immigration. So that is why you have immigration to the rich countries from developing countries in the global south. You don't have immigration like that to developing countries. So see, so Indonesia is not getting like hundreds of thousands of workers from East Timor, right? Or Palau or something like that, right? Because it has its own people to make them work and find work for them, right? So that is why rich countries open up immigration in order to keep workers going. That is why the United States doesn't have much of a problem compared to many other developing countries, because it has a very generous immigration system and it has a very robust population. Its population is growing, continuing to grow, although it's a very developed country, because of immigration. Get it? So all these things matter in terms of how these translate into the cities and the urban spaces, etc., because those are the main epicenters of work and sort of revenue generation in times. Anyway, so eventually, this is a very quick thing. I'm just not going to belabor too much. So at some point, like these are the years 2010, so somewhere around here, from about 2025. So China's population has already started going down. This is China, this brown one. India is projected to go down here. So about by 2050 or so, after that, India's population is also going to decline. So China's has declined so rapidly because it had that one child policy. And now it has a problem because now its population is not growing and suddenly it has become very developed and it needs to provide a lot of, all these welfare services, etc., infrastructure, and it's finding very hard to keep up. So it's encouraging people to have more babies. So is Japan. Okay, so lots of these developed countries. So this is an interesting conundrum, right? Now look at this one again. So by China and India again, these are the projected, sort of cohorts by 2050, right? So everything's going to shrink. The base is going to shrink, the middle is going to shrink, everything's going to shrink. Yeah. So anyway, so this will create unique kinds of problems for. Why am I saying unique kinds of problems? Because most of the global south hasn't experienced that yet. We still keep talking about rapid urbanization, such rapid urbanization. We always talk in these superlatives and all of this, like alarmist kind of things. Oh, the population is growing so much, 100 million people, 1 billion people living in slums and that kind of thing, right? So it creates the alarm. It's as if it's a never ending process. No, it is already beginning to kind of slow down. That's the point I was trying to make here. Okay. Yet, because of the size of the population of many of the countries in the global south, we still have a big challenge in our hands, right? So that's the question here. So anyway, oh, this is Japan. See, Japan's become an inverted pyramid. So, see, so Japan in 1980 looked like this. See, this was problematic. There were very few teenagers. This part was bulking up. People were living longer. And now look at it. There are so many elderly people in Japan, right? And look how few, what the base. So this is kind of unsustainable, right? So this is so they have to figure out. They'll have to change their policies. Like Charles mentioned, they are actually importing a lot of workers, temporary workers. So that's another issue. How do you treat them in terms of equity and access? Because Japan doesn't grant citizenship or a route to permanent residency. They just contract workers. Many other countries do in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and North America. Anyway, okay. So now we'll talk about spatial transformation and planning, right? Okay. So the things that I would like you to I mean, get out of this presentation and also from this course in general are some of these things. You'll figure out try to figure out answers or think about these issues and propose some ways to get there, right? So first of all, why do cities grow or what drives urbanization, right? So first one is, what is this natural population growth? Any idea? What does that mean? It's a very simple thing. Number of people born minus number of people getting or dying. If that's in the positive, natural population growth, right? Now we saw the natural population growth is declining in many places, right? So then this is the other thing, migration. People migrate to cities, right? So why do people migrate to cities? Because there are economic things. We generally think about economic refugees or economic migrants only. That cities are places of opportunity. Yes, the vast majority of people come there because of that. Okay, so this I'm talking about how do cities grow or what drives urbanization, right? So meaning cities are expanding or more cities are coming up, more people are living in or more people are living in cities, right? So they may not be spatially expanding, they could be, or the populations are increasing, right? Depends on how we define urbanization, right? Is it just a demographic, definition, or is it a spatial definition? So you could actually have very big, a footprint of a city and yet actually could theoretically be losing population. It is true. So like there are cities like say Detroit, Michigan, for example, the big footprint in its heyday, it was a very bustling city and today it is not. There are many places like that in the US, in sort of around the Great Lakes area. There are many cities like that. Anyway, but they're also in other places. In the global south, you haven't seen that because we are still in that, remember the overall that S curve is still going up. We haven't started slowing down, right? Migration. So economic conflict causes, it can be whatever, war, ethnic clashes, other kinds of things. And I mention this because we are witnessing more and more of this. It is expected that we'll have more conflict because of climate change. Both, not just conflict, you will have conflict, but climate change will force people out because the people who are dependent in the rural areas, dependent on those primary sector activities, which have a direct relationship to land or water or whatever, those are being affected, right? And their capacity to sustain themselves off the land and of the water is sharply declining and rapidly declining, right? So you are seeing climate migrants also, right? That's also happening. The conflict and climate change, can anyone mention an example in recent times which is at the root of this problem or challenge of migration was climate change and conflict? Anybody? Yes. Yeah, you could. Yeah, probably. Yeah. So, but I'm saying it hasn't seen that much conflict yet, right? Yeah, you're right. Pacific Islands, many of them are facing this, right? So I think even like places like Kiribati and all are going to be. So anyway, Syria is the example I was talking about, right? Syria, the conflict is still ongoing, but at the root of it was basically climate change and how it affected agriculture and livelihoods and things like that, right? So that's why you see Syrian migrants fleeing and whatever. Now there's violent conflict, all of that, right? Then also political acts, right? This is sometimes, right? So political acts, by that I mean when governments decide, so we need to urbanize or we need to create more cities, right? Can you think of any example like that? Or whatever, anything, just creating more cities, right? Okay. How about Indonesia? IKN, Nusantara, that's what I was getting at, right? So there are going to be people living there. It's going to attract more people, right? So it's completely new urbanization, right? So that also happens. So that's why I said it's a political act. Because this is because this is the next question I was getting to. How do cities transform spatially, right? One, they could just spontaneously and organically. If your people are already living as an urban settlement or whatever as a group, they will grow and they'll morph into something else. It'll become bigger. So there's a spatial transformation. Deliberately, you can do this, right? This is something that we've seen particularly in the 20th century, beginning in the late 19th century, where we started planning and designing cities in a way that they could accommodate more people, or or we are expanding them. So this is this whole concept of, this is the core spatial planning stuff that I'm getting to, right? The master planning, all of this. 10 years from now, we would like people to be living here, this way, over there. We'll build this new city expansion over here. All of that, is kind of the spatial plan. So that's deliberate planning. We are also growing, right? But it's also deliberate, for example, which is okay. So deliberately, then we have, that's one way of looking at it. So I mean, there are deliberate acts that lead to urban expansion. For example, China did that, Korea did that. A lot of the sort of those Asian tiger economies did something like that. So Taiwan, so they wanted to urbanize their populations, right? And they wanted to convert villages into cities and have sort of amenities and standards of living that were more like the cities, and more, quote unquote, modernize their populations, right? Then there is something which is desirable, right? So I'm saying I'm just saying these are ways you can think about spatial transformation. There's some spatial transformations that are desirable, some are not. They're desirable if you can do it sustainably. If our cities are sustainable, resilient, that's the whole theme of this course, right? Equitable. That means everybody kind of benefits from that. It's not only that some segments of the, socioeconomic sort of hierarchy, benefit from it, or some geographical sort of populations and specific populations benefit from it, right? Some regions benefit, some don't. Not like that. Everybody equitably. So in all ways that you can think of slicing and dicing the society, everyone kind of benefits, right? That is equitable, right? Inclusive, again, same thing, right? That, we will involve you in development and you will get the benefit. You are not welcome, that sort of thing, right? So inclusive is deliberate in a way, again, or being exclusive is deliberate, that we're not excluding. Equitable may or may not be deliberate. Okay. The outcomes of development efforts or planning efforts might not be distributed evenly. It's not intentional necessarily. So this is the point I'm trying to make here. So equitable may be unintentional. Inequity might be unintentional, yet very problematic. Whereas exclusion is deliberate. Get it? So that's how it's. And of course, exclusion is inequity. There's no question about that, right? Then undesirably, anything opposite to the above is undesirable, right? Slowly versus rapidly, right? The urbanization rates in different regions might be different within a country, within a continent, like that, because it depends on many other factors, right? Economic, political, maybe environmental, lots of those things, right? So they might be all urbanizing, changing, transforming, but some might be happening more rapidly and some may not be, right? And then incrementally versus suddenly. The difference here is that either for some of these spontaneous forces, this number one over here, or some of the deliberate efforts, you could change cities and transform them incrementally, gradually, so in a more patient way versus suddenly. And by sudden, I don't mean instantaneously, but say within a year or two, you see like a complete sea change in sort of the spatial configuration of a place or something, right? That, and it happens all the time. So some are more, so these are, there might be more ways you can think of how to sort of conceptualize spatial transformation, right? Anyway, so now, how does spatial transformation matter for sustainability and resilience, right? It matters because any expansion in development, right? Any urbanization is obviously going to put stress on the environment and the ecological balance, right? So if we do it more cognizantly and more sort of sensitively, we could mitigate some of that. That's an obvious thing, right? You have more cars, there's going to be more pollution, right? You want to build more houses, it's necessary, to house people. You are going to like need more land, you're going to burn more fossil fuels for all the construction materials. You'll have to have more sewer systems, you'll have to have more water supply systems, you'll expand existing. So everything is energy intensive and sort of land intensive in a way, right? Expansion, so that's important, right? You could maybe save on land by going higher up. That's another idea nowadays, like building densely higher, but that puts also more stress and sometimes disproportionately more stress on some of the natural resources that you depend on, particularly water, for example, right? As well as other things. Anyway, so we have to know how to do this, right? The second thing is somebody mentioned is social, cultural impacts and influences, right? Right. So Lahela, I know that she does research on something which is talking about how urbanization affects cultures, the ways of life of indigenous communities, because they're never really, right? That kind of thing. People lament the fact that, oh, in the past, it used to be so nice. I could just walk here and there was a market here, garden here. Now it's all gone. I hate to go to I can't cross the street anymore, right? So it changes. So those kinds of things. But even otherwise, what people do for recreation. Now people go maybe and sip lattes at a Starbucks. When your grandparents never did that, it was a different kind of, so it changes and it becomes homogenous and sort of, whatever you call it, globalized, universal, monotonous. But it is true that for a certain class of people, who reside and sort of, and they're mostly urban residents, the ways they lead their life and the ways in which they lead their lives are quite similar across the globe today, especially in big cities, right? Anyway. And then but it also means that how things are changing, how a city transforms is also determined by some of these things. Get it? It depends on the existing cultural sort of practices, existing social trends, existing social or cultural consumptive trends, etc., in a particular society, right? So, for example, some societies might be more conservative than others, right? So how they might want to see development is a little different, right? So maybe the governments would respond to that, be mindful of that sort of thing, right? So, for example, living in, say, Saudi Arabia is quite different from living in Indonesia, for instance, right? They are both Islamic societies predominantly, but still very different, right? So that's what I mean, right? So how cities are shaped, what happens is also kind of, sort of reflect some of this. So it's both the influences on spatial transformations or sort of uh, as well as the impacts of spatial transformation on. So it's kind of a sort of a like a self-feeding sort of a cycle, right? So then, what has been the purpose? So why do we get into spatial planning? I haven't defined spatial planning yet, right? So we'll try to do this during the course of this course. But maybe very briefly, we can see, what do you think is spatial planning? I don't know it myself, so don't worry about it, right? I don't have the answer. But how would you define spatial planning in your way? So spatial comes from the word space. That's what you need to understand. So we're talking about urban space, right? So, okay. So now what is spatial planning? What do you think? Or you can give me elements of that and maybe we can make a definition very quickly. Yes, Jake.
Spatial planning around what land you have or
Okay. So planning around maybe like figuring out what you have as resources and how you go about it, right? Anything else? What else would matter? Just not, is that land or what else? Okay, that's another. So yeah, what else? So land is there. That's a resource you have to use. You have to use it optimally because it's not probably endless, right? Yeah, it might seem that there's endless land, but maybe, Even in the US, which seems like endless, is a lot of land. Yeah, it's or Australia. Like the city has its limits, right? The city has a boundary. Just cannot go galloping, like 100 miles out and build something because it's not in their jurisdiction, right? So whatever it is. So you've got land. What else do you need? What do you need to respond to? Why do you want to manage cities? Why do you want to do it? Why? Why do we want to shape cities in a certain way?
Prevent future problems before they start.
Okay. More specifically, some things like, for example, why? Okay.
You know,
Transportation is one, right? Mobility, people need to get around. Why do people need to get around? Yeah. Anybody else? Nuri, why do people need to get around? Louder. Why do people need to move in cities, go from one place? Why? Okay, education. Work is one, right? Other things, education. What else do you want to go? Why do you need to go out of your house? Kind of thing, right? Yeah, activities, right? Exactly.
Spatial plan is to provide, kind of aspects for each activity so that we provide.
Good. Yeah. So entertainment, recreation, education, whatever, right? The bulk of that is consumed by work related travel. So if you design cities well, you can minimize travel, right? So most people in big cities, I think the number one complaint today when cities become big is traffic, right? There's a difference between Jakarta and Samarang, for example. And I think most people in Samarang will keep saying, "Oh yeah, traffic is getting bad. It's getting worse," right? That sort of thing. So it's a story that's everywhere. So the arrangement, okay, between different functions of the city, and so the functions translate into connectivity. They translate into spaces, meaning this is for housing, this is for industry, that kind of thing. So I'm not using the term directly. Basically, land use in a way, right? And how you regulate land use. And then sort of the built form controls. Land use is one thing, but then how much do you allow to be built on that? That's the architectural sort of building construction standards and all of those controls, right? We'll allow something which is 30 stories here, 50 stories here, 2 stories here, that kind of thing. High, mid rise, high rise, mid rise, low rise, high density, low density, all of those things. All of that is spatial planning in a way, right? So it has to be integrated with all of these things, right? So this is the thing. So, and then there's this political impacts and influences, right? However, sometimes political impacts and influences override some of these other concerns. Okay, so the way a city is developed, right? For example, so this is particularly evident in, say, for example, many people maybe would not like to have a huge mall built right next to their house, even in Indonesia. Right, where people like to go to the mall a lot, but I don't think if they like it right across, if they want, because the traffic is going to come, it's become so noisy. Nobody likes that, right? But somehow things get built sometimes, right? So those things are somewhat political in a way, right? Political, I'm saying, I mean, a very, by politics here, I don't mean like politicians getting involved, but it means who has more influence, which groups in society, right? Like the developer community, the wealthy, or a certain class, maybe somebody from the government. That's political in a way, right? So, so where somehow not everybody has equal right in this in a way. Get it? Okay. So, so those are the things of why does it matter for sustainability and resilience? Because if you don't do things the right way, you can have environmental, social, cultural influences which are really detrimental in a way, right? And undesirable. And some of these things are very, if not irreversible, very difficult to turn back, right? To undo in a way. Okay. So next one, okay. So why have you been doing? So why is this spatial planning so important, right? So, around the world, when planning started, modern planning, and starts around maybe, so I'm not going to go into history of planning courses, but maybe some people don't have the background. So maybe the first sort of in modern times, the first sort of efforts to actually, regulate cities and design cities or plan cities goes back to the last couple of decades of the 19th century. countries like Germany and the UK. We read about the garden city concept a lot, for example. So these were all, and then lots of other things like the City Beautiful movement and all of these things, so which were about making city look nice with gardens, boulevards, more well laid out streets, etc. So, but this is all very physical, right? Very physical. But with the physical interventions, they wanted to solve some of the social and economic problems that were there in the very rapidly transforming industrial cities of Europe and North America. Now, what they were doing there, meaning in those countries, is also something that became sort of more, I mean, that was also implemented in the many parts of the developing world or the global south, because many of those countries were colonies. Okay, so what you saw in the early sort of planning of Batavia, for example, Jakarta, was what the Dutch were doing in the other colonies. So it's very, so you'll see a lot of, even today you can trace back, if you go to a city that was under the Spaniards, you see Spanish planning and built form logics over there, right? The British cities look different. So you get the point, right? So whatever they were doing, so there's a lot of modern city planning efforts being done, mostly physical, spatial planning to organize, clean up, make it more efficient, less messy. Whatever is happening in Europe and North America, we also see that happening in many other parts of the world, right? Okay, but they wanted to do that because they believe that this is for the public good. And by the public good is a broad definition, to benefit the public, right? So maybe make the cities safer, cleaner, okay, easier to navigate, faster. That's why you would invest in, let's say, public transportation, including like at some point maybe horse-drawn carriages, then trams, whatever, buses, those kinds of things, right? So you always believe that through spatial planning, you're actually doing public, you're enhancing, enlarging the public good, doing it for the people, right? And then the second thing is livability. This is another concept, slightly different. This is a more modern concept, that those things might already be in place in some places, but can we make it better? Right? The quality of life, can it still improve? It's not that you're deprived of those things. So that is livability, right? This includes things like recreation, sort of cleanliness, having a sense of place, all those kinds of things. So this also involves a lot of spatial design and reconfiguration, particularly in today's day and age, right? So things like whatever, smart growth, etc., transit-oriented development. These are all efforts to these are all spatial planning efforts, right? But they're trying to sort of enhance the livability of cities in a way, right? Now, so what have been the problems with spatial planning? This is now the thing. You have to remember that spatial planning is, like I said, has done a lot of good, and it has been very effective in sort of at least keeping cities on some sort of guided track of development rather than go completely sort of haywire in a way, right? At the same time, spatial planning has been criticized very heavily, particularly by Western scholars, because of the damage it has done, more so in North America, more so in like how the cities of the US and Canada have transformed, right? Why? Because, and again, it's also being criticized today for a lot of the problems that still persist in developing countries, right? Because spatial planning has generally been a very top-down process, very exclusive, right? By exclusive, I mean that very few people have been, very few groups in the population, very few representatives of groups are involved in this. Because this is exclusively being treated as something which is very expert driven, expertise driven. So you have to be qualified, otherwise there's no conversation also, right? So it's usually the preserve of some national ministry of planning or what have you, or the city department, or if it's in the US also, like only the local governments of, and the planning departments will mostly engage in this. So as compared to many other things, let's say if you want to plan for education or health or, or some other community development things, you tend to see more participation and more engagement, not so with spatial planning, because it's believed that, oh, it's so complicated, it's so esoteric a field that you cannot just, have anyone. So it's been a very top-down process, right? And a lot of the things, even they were well-intentioned, like building of the freeway systems. And interestingly, whatever the US did, or North America or Europe to a lesser extent, but even in Europe, same kinds of mistakes were made. But today, the rest of the world is following the same mistakes, right? So there you see much more investment in building freeways and like highway systems as opposed to public transit systems, right? You see much more investment in like, luxury housing and like gated communities and independent cities as opposed to like more public housing or sort of more mixed use housing, more mixed use development, more transit. So these things, I mean, so again, so that kind of development led to a lot of ecological and environmental harm. So urban sprawl, it's been proven empirically, caused a lot of environment. So the main concern with sprawl was environmental problems, actually, right? Because of the pollution it was causing, because of the depletion of water resources, et cetera, et cetera. But also then the social and psychological kinds of impacts it had on people. Okay, because communities got fragmented, social lives got sort of frayed, right? Those kinds of things, right? So a lot of this harm has happened to society. And then this is interesting. So I want to use this term. So you might have heard of the term like social justice, right? Most people have probably heard, right? Social justice. You probably heard of the term environmental justice, right? Everybody clear?
Oh, I was just a second.
Yeah. So anyone want to just quickly clarify what is environmental justice? Yes.
It's when the space that several different groups share.
Yeah.
Is equitable to all those groups, where one group existing in one space does not negatively impact more.
Okay. Yeah. So easier way to look at it is the injustice, for example. Let's start with that, right? So it's easier. So environmental injustice means that whatever environmental burdens, right? Pollution. Who suffers more from pollution? Water pollution, air pollution. You will usually find that it is a weaker sort of group of the population. Poorer, maybe some ethnic group, maybe some linguistic group, whatever. Some sort of marginalized, disenfranchised, disempowered group, right? Always. It would also be like women are more disadvantaged than men kind of thing, right? So that's also when you have environmental burdens, meaning let's say polluted areas, etc., or mainly related to pollution actually of various kinds, and when it has a negative impact, you find, or where environmental services are not provided. That means like water, sanitation, those kinds of services, right? That the lacking of services is much more evident or prominent in lower income neighborhoods or other neighborhoods. Right? So that's the thing, right? So that's environmental injustice, right? So similarly, social injustice, like, that when people don't get equal opportunity to move up in society, the social mobility is impaired. That's social injustice in many ways, right? It's a social justice issue. It could be related to, let's say, people having a voice, people's rights at work, whatever. Broadly speaking, that's social injustice, right? Similarly, you can have like cultural injustices also, and this is very prominent with maybe indigenous cultures versus the rest, right? So suku asli rights in Indonesia, for example, right? I mean, not even considered in many cases in any kind of government effort or policy, right? Of course, now there's more awareness, but in the past, I'm saying, right, that kind of thing. So we had a professor called Professor Ed Soja, who was an expert on something called spatial justice, a planning theorist, right? So he said something very interesting. He said, all of this, it's important for us people, like, planners and other people who work in cities and about cities, right? To realize and appreciate the fact that all injustices are spatial in nature. It does not just happen in a vacuum. So you can associate social justice to special pockets and spaces where that is more prevalent, right? So, and this is important because he said, especially from city standpoints, it is very important to realize this, right? So economic injustices are also manifested in space. So all of these injustices, economic, social, cultural, etc., are actually forms of spatial injustice, right? So spatial planning, the way we have done it, this top down and all this sort of exclusive kind of planning, has actually contributed to a lot of spatial injustices. So we have the chance to remedy some of that. Okay? So this is the broad, basically, idea, right? So how can spatial planning be made more effective to enable cities to be sustainable and resilient, right? So again, some of the things I just said from that, integrate land use, transportation, and housing concerns better. Those are the three things that impact people's lives the most on a daily basis if you're an urban resident, right? So to think about this, right? And how to think about it, all of these things guided by equity and justice goals. You have to think about the sections which are the least, sort of served who are the most sort of discriminated, can they benefit from whatever we are doing through spatial planning? So that has to be paramount, right? That kind of thing. Then the whole process of spatial planning, I'm not saying that it should be taken away from government ministries or private firms, but there should be much more transparency and public accountability, which in the global south is still missing, especially when it comes to spatial planning and infrastructure planning, big ones, right? You see this much more in small scale, neighborhood level, grassroots planning for community development, etc., but not for this, right? Even in, so then this is also important. How another way to do this is encourage more institutional collaboration, because often for spatial planning, governments, local governments, etc., look to cities, so to the universities for the expertise, because sometimes it is really technical and it involves a lot of research, which is beyond the capacity of a local government unit to do it on its own. So it does engage universities. So then universities have a role to make it much more collaborative, much more public, much more inclusive, right? So I'm also calling on universities that you should be able to do this, right? And similarly with civil society organizations. So these are NGOs, other kinds of community organizations, community-based organizations. They know what is the lay of the land the best, meaning they understand grassroots level concerns and potentials and capacities the best. So they must be engaged in that, right? They can also act as a bridge. Remember how Professor John Stone was talking about trust. Okay, you want to build trust. I mean, usually the disempowered and disenfranchised, historically marginalized communities don't have too much trust in the government. Right. And I'm saying that most of spatial planning is done by government agencies, right? You want to remedy the trust, you have to sort of maybe you must work with civil society organizations. And there are many places in the world, including in developing countries, where these kinds of approaches of using civil society organizations as intermediaries has actually helped a lot. Okay. All right. And then, of course, if that happens, then you can enable more citizen participation in the planning and development processes. And this can be done in many different ways. You can do it in the conventional, standard, physical meetings way. Because again, I'm not going to go into the details, but there's a lot of research on this also. Like how, where, when, with whom should you hold meetings? Now it is increasingly, I mean, young people are much more digitally savvy, for example, so you can use digital ways of participation, but not only digital, because that's another way of excluding, because not one may have access. So anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that spatial planning can actually be done in a much better way than it has been done traditionally, right? And so these are the ways, and some of the ways in which it can be done. Okay. So I'm just going to take you through some very quick things now. So this is interesting. So you'll get this, the slides later, right? So this is just showing like where are the highest rates of urbanization, right? So these big circles. So as you can see, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Urbanization is now happening in more low-income countries than in the past, right? So most of the urbanization today is happening in these poor countries. See, so it's moving like this, Then again, like we already done this, the share of poor people living in urban areas. This is also very, very interesting, right? Overall, incomes have risen in most countries. Like I just told you that as urbanization expands, as countries become more developed, you have more urbanization. Where there is more urbanization, you'll find that there is more development, right? So per capita incomes, etc., have risen. But what has also been rising, especially in the global south, in fast urbanizing countries, is that the inequity in wealth has been rising. So the rich people have become much richer. So nowadays you hear these things like 1% of the population of this country owns more than 50% of the wealth, 60% of the wealth, that kind of thing, right? So the richest, so overall, when you look at the GDP or whatever, much of that is captured by a very small percentage of the population at the very top. Everyone's incomes and wealth has increased, but not relatively. Relative to that increase, things like the rising costs of living, etc., actually makes life more difficult. So relatively speaking, and sometimes in absolute terms, urban poverty has been rising also. So I said, again, I'll repeat that. So in absolute terms, in actual whatever numbers or yardstick you use, you'll find more poor people in cities. If it is not that, you'll still find relative poverty, that relative to the richer sections, you find many more people who are now disadvantaged and they cannot make ends meet for various reasons, right? So that's another thing. So this economic inequality, which translates to a lot of other kinds of inequalities, is been rising also with. So there's a need to sort of think of our cities in different ways, basically, right? Anyway, and then the other problem is that cities in the global south, where you see the most urbanization happening and the fastest rates of growth, also have the fewest resources. That's because this rapid transition in the last 40, 50 years has been so rapid that by comparison, they have not been able to develop, for various reasons. That's a different whole subject matter, right? As to why they haven't been able to do this. That's for political reasons, institutional reasons, whatever, right? Anyway, so this is something which is interesting, that this is from this thing called the World Resources Institute. That's a think tank, and it brings out this annual sort of the big report every few years. So this is from the last report, and you'll get references to this later. Don't worry about it. So they have conceptualized the cities today as like emerging cities, thriving cities. So again, this is X, Y-axis, X-axis. This is the first quadrant. So positive, positive. So high income today, high income growth related to the population growth, you know. So there are two variables. This is high for income today and high relative to population growth. This is low today, but high in compared to the population. Anyway, so what you need to know is they have conceptualized, okay, there are thriving cities, emerging cities, struggling cities, and stabilizing cities. So what they look like today, so it might be, let's say, in terms of income, they might look high, but in this income, low income growth relative to population in this period. So this is showing that although they have high income, they may not really grow that fast because of the high population. So anyway, so this is one way of conceptualizing, right, the things. But so it's, again, the important thing is that there are different kinds of cities. We have got different kinds of potentials and challenges because of these things, right? So some of this translates, I'll now show you pictures, right? So this is in Caracas, Venezuela. So this is spatial injustice, right? Spatial inequity, whatever you want to call it, right? So this way, this is the main highway. All of this, as you can see, is whatever is planned, formal planning, development, and this is all informal settlements, right? Way more dense, many times more dense than this. Hardly any services compared to them. And this is continuing. But this is not peculiar to Caracas. This is Nairobi, right? It's one of the largest slums in the world. Okay. This shows poor access to sanitation. So what you see in the background here, oh, sorry, what did I just do? I did something. Wait a second. Press the middle button, I guess. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Just a few more. So this is basically no access to services. Things are better now in some pockets, but it's a huge slum. There's no clear estimate. Oh, it's estimated like close to 1 million people probably live, or in this, right? So what you see here, this is human feces. These are called flying toilets. So because there is no, it's also unsafe in many ways, for especially women. So people defecate in plastic bags and they toss it and throw it. It's called flying toilets. Okay. So there are NGOs and all working to remedy this thing, but still it's not been fully resolved, right? So I'm trying to show you the different kinds of problems. This is all manifested in space, right? So why is there no spatial planning here, for example, right? So then these are, again, self-built. This is informal. They're all informal settlements. The point I'll talk about informality a little later in the next lecture, maybe a little bit more, but you see a lot of places which are informal, right? So again, many people think those are illegal, criminal. No, it's not like that. It is out of necessity that people build this. And it reflects the inability of the state to respond in an effective way to the challenge, right? Because the state is not able to provide, or because it excludes, because it does not include, whatever, people are forced to this. But they are not, living off any doles or charity from the government. They actually contribute to the economy of the city, very essential to the economy of the city, right? So anyway, so this is in Quito, but here actually they installed like a bus lane. This was taken when we were there, maybe about over 10 years ago though. So there was a bus route that was going up to the top. Very, very difficult to do these kinds of things, right? So this is in Bangladesh. This is another one of the world's biggest slums called Korail, right? So yeah, Ernest probably knows this from Dhaka. So this is like, many of this is floating. People actually expand the land by dumping plastic and other kinds of waste to make some land. They grow and they have to live on this. They fish, they do all kinds of, there's a lot of agriculture actually that happens here. Urban agriculture in these green spaces here. The people grow vegetables, etc. But they're forced to live here, right? Again, look at that behind. And so this kind of spatial unevenness and injustice, that's the thing, right? And sometimes, or not sometimes, many times, one has to remember that building the modern city requires labor. So in developing countries, most of the labor comes from somewhere else, other smaller cities or the rural hinterland. They live in temporary encampments. Then what happens? So we don't build housing for them. So they might build like the next sort of independent city living or whatever, big mega project, right? But there will be no place for them to live in it, right? So we have to think about these things. That is inclusion and exclusion, right? So then the building of cities in certain ways, the planning and design of cities in certain ways leads to the creation of informal settlements. That's also something we have to understand, right? This is Mumbai. This is the world's largest slum, probably. If you saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire, this is where it was filmed. This is Dharavi. Okay. Again, very high density, right? Over 1 million people live in Dharavi. And it is estimated that the annual turnover from business in Dharavi is over 1 billion US dollars, 1 billion with a B, satu miliar, dollars per year, right? That's how high. Anyway, so this is Rio, same thing. Now, these are also places which don't have any, again, violence is an issue because they don't trust the government. Like there are gangs which run these places. We've seen the movies about it, documentaries about it. But in terms of real life challenges for people, they don't have any water supply, etc. So the people have had to provide these informally on their own, improvise, right? In these places. That's Sao Paulo, Brazil. Okay. This is an iconic picture. Some of you might have already seen it. I wanted to pay attention to these two buildings here, right? Okay. So this is like one of the biggest slums here. Sao Paulo is the business capital of Latin America, right? The biggest. And it's so congested and crowded that rich people actually fly around in helicopters to go from one. Like in Jakarta, you say you cannot do like two things in one day. There people fly in helicopters in order to get to. So anyway, so highest ownership of per capita of helicopters is in Sao Paulo in the world, right? So look at this picture now, right? So these are balconies. These are luxury apartments, each with individual swimming pools. And this is overlooking this slum here. So again, a picture. So this is this one. And these, so it's also very perverse in a way, right? I mean, it's sometimes we should question us, like, is it acceptable? How do we sort of, anyway, so again, these are philosophical kinds of questions also, but it's important, right? Anyway, this is with Bulili here in the background. So we went to Kampung Chilincing in Jakarta, right? This is where they're building very close to this, that great Garuda project and all of that. Fancy mega project ideas are over there, right? But the real thing is that there are very poor communities which live here. So actually, Bulili works in these communities, right? And they are they're below sea level, and the sea level has been rising. So they've had to be raising. So this is this wall we're sitting here, right? That's the wall over here. So if you see here, so this wall is already about 10 feet higher than where we are standing in a way, right? So if it breaks or breaches or something, if they stop doing this, then these are the people who will be the most impacted, right? Okay. Finally, so in response, so I won't talk about sustainable development goals. Maybe I'll come back to it at a different time, but Sonia already, I think, mentioned about this. These are some examples of urban sprawl. I want to show you what the rich world did, right? I showed you Global South pictures. So this is, anybody recognize this city? Los Angeles, iconic, right? So, so a lot of developing country planners love this idea. We need to build freeways like this. Why? This is, I mean, they love this idea. Like Jakarta's done this, Bangkok has done this, Mumbai is doing this, New Delhi has this, Manila has this. I mean, this kind of stuff. And look at this endless sprawl, right? There's the other thing, suburban sprawl. Once you go beyond the city, where it's just suburban communities, which are basically more like bedroom communities, only some jobs. This is what is in the US they call cookie cutter. It's like you take the same mold, tuck, 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 you keep going, right? And this is interesting. This is also in the city of Portland, Oregon. Okay, so here you see this line. This side is rural. So this is something I'll tell you later. It's called the urban growth boundary. So anyway, so the city development has happened till here. It's not happened beyond that. But some things are just like that. This is Mexico City. This is probably still the largest city in the world, right? Depending on if you look at it some ways, right? For the longest time, it was the biggest city after Tokyo, and it overtook Tokyo, right? So in population, yeah. Right. But also it's massive in terms of spread. It's been spreading more and more. So a lot of new development has been happening in Mexico where low income housing, I mean, so the government has built a lot of public housing, but all of it is like in these far flung areas outside, right? So it's interesting, right? This one. So this one, as you can see, this is an example. This is not an urban growth boundary. This is why I wanted to show you this one. So this one is actually, this development should not have been here. So whatever, the story is complicated, but developers were able to get hold of this land and build stuff here, right? Not overnight. It's happened over many years, but this is supposed to be rural lands, right? So this is not an urban growth boundary. This is a natural stop because they haven't been able to acquire lands beyond this, but they'll try. So this is happening in many places. This is called peri-urbanization, where the cities, I mean, spilling over into the rural areas without any of the administrative capacities, any of the fiscal capacities, or any of the technical capacities to manage those things. So it's very inorganic, organic and very spontaneous kind of development, right? Ejido, what? Peri-urban, sorry, peri-urban, peri-urban, yeah. So yeah, so it's a lot of, it's very evident in many parts of this of Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, Indonesia, India, where peri-urbanization. So I mean, China happened. There's a lot of peri-urbanization because the city is expanding so quickly. You need more lands, right? So you're acquiring. So technically, it's not easy to change the lands from agricultural to urban usage, right? But then, whatever, there are processes by which it can be done, and they are not necessarily equitable, right? That's the thing. Yeah.
Is the creation of slums, such as the example you provided in Dhaka, adding, would that be considered peri-urbanization as well?
No, this is very much in the heart. That's a big lake in the middle of the city that people are doing it themselves. That's basically like informal settlements, informality. That's a different topic.
So because the space is already urban.
The space is urban. It's a lake in the city. So people, they're living on water. So there are many pictures like that. So a significant number of people, like I don't know what, it's like maybe a couple of percent actually, and a large percent of the slum dwellers, the informal settlement people in Lagos, Nigeria, live on a lake because the land is not available. That's even the informal sector, informal settlements, the land is so expensive that they have to live on water kind of thing. And there's a market over there also, right?
So that doesn't count.
No, a peri-urban means it's beyond the boundary of the city. Get it? So the city has a boundary, right? I mean, it has a municipal boundary. So when urbanization kind of development is happening beyond the boundary, that's not under the jurisdiction of the city, but it is basically serving the city because it's spillover housing, some factories are maybe going there, whatever, right? Or they're just growing in response to providing services, whatever. Their businesses, etc. That is peri-urbanization. But what it is doing, what peri-urbanization is doing, is basically eating up agricultural land. That's another concern, right? Yeah, Charles.
For here, the peri-urbanization is Kota Desasi peri-urbanization.
Kota again?
Kota Desasi, the north,
The north coast.
north coast of Java. The villages.
Yes, you can say that. But I don't know because I don't know the exact jurisdiction. So I will not say for a certain thing. But if it's in the rural areas, yes, it will happen. It will happen along corridors, transport corridors, for sure. Yeah. Yes. So so if it's beyond the city limits, if it's happening on its own, that's peri-urbanization, right? Okay. Finally, I just wanted to show you, just leave with a few images, but after the 1950s in developing countries, and this is coming back to that point of the political acts to create cities, right? So it's not only developing countries, developed countries also have that, but developing countries have tried to create new cities. This is not because the response was for maybe to accommodate new industries or whatever, to relieve the pressure of economic development on one city or something, but these were more about creating administrative centers, meaning capital cities in a way, right? Because of the stature or whatever. So this is Islamabad. Okay. So the plan for Islamabad, this master plan. So this is the concept of master planning. That's the quintessential tool of spatial planning. In the US, it's called comprehensive planning. in rest of the world, it was called master planning, right? You have a master plan which you'll follow for the next 20 years, 30 years, whatever the duration you've created, long term, right? And you'll follow that. But there are many problems with that. Like, how do you know? And now, increasingly more so, everything changes very rapidly. I mean, not just technology, but even like the social and the cultural sort of systems and the practices and whatever status quo. So anyway, so this was designed by this Greek architect planner called Doxiadis. Doxiadis was also very sensitive about sustainability, acoustics. Yeah, very good. So he started this field. So he was very conscious about. So his idea. So it's actually considered to be a good plan in a way, right? I mean, for its thinking. But the point I'm trying to make is that cities don't just grow and they cannot just be wished into existence and designed to perform perfectly, right? You know, you can make these attempts. So these are some very notable attempts or prominent attempts. So this is Islamabad. This is Chandigarh. So Chandigarh was created. So Islamabad became the capital of the country of Pakistan. So when the British left, they divided what was undivided India into Pakistan and India, right? West Pakistan and India, and East Pakistan was Bangladesh. So West Pakistan needed a capital city for itself because the capital was New Delhi. So they had to make Islamabad. Then there's a big province, the biggest province, one of the most richest provinces was called Punjab, the Punjab. So the bigger part of Punjab, which is the capital city of which is Lahore, went to Pakistan. So India was not left with any big city. So India needed a city for its Punjab. So they decided to build a state capital, which was Chandigarh. And this is probably the most famous design city in the 20th century, right? By the famous Le Corbusier, the Swiss French architect, right? So anyway, so these were all master plan, right? So very good. But the problem is, if we can discuss this later, it was planned, everything. This person will live here, these kinds of people will live here. It was not planned for the poor people, not planned for informal sector workers, thinking that it's not required. Get it? So that was the short-sightedness or the folly of planning, right? Anyone recognize this one? This is done by a student of Le Corbusier's. This is in the 1960s. They built the capital of Brazil. They moved it to Brasilia. So this is the master plan for Brasilia, right? And quiz question. Anyone recognize this one? This is still in the works, right? So anyway, so so I'll end it here for now. So okay. So if you have some, I know I'm out of town, but you have time. So if you have any questions, we can quickly ask that.
It just crossed my mind about spatial formation. We talk about urban sprawl. We talk about suburban sprawl. Could we call the reclamation, the expansion of islands, like what China is doing in South China Sea? You know, creation of islands. The expansion of Singapore with reclamation. Could we call that island sprawl? You could find that. After your dissertation research, you are welcome to do that. I mean, in my mind. Yeah. So you have to understand what is sprawl, right? Right. Sprawl is basically, so there were two or three things. One was the sprawl was also population, but also sort of marked by discontinuity sometimes. Sprawl was also notable for what is called leapfrog. So sometimes what happened was you were creating a community over there. This is all left out, but you have a connection. There's a highway that's right there, so you can get bigger. So that is what. So this was not used. You jumped over there, and the density was much lower. Right. This is the thing. So the difference between say urban and suburban sprawl is like urban sprawl is like when the city keeps just growing outward, and it could do it otherwise, but it keeps growing, and the city boundary is moving with it. And suburban is kind of like it can be within the city limits sometimes, but it can be also in the neighboring city or something, right? But it is the density is much lower than what you see in a urban neighborhood in a way, right? And it's much more single use in the United States or in like any of the sprawling sort of cities or other developed countries. You're creating more space because you need more for the people. Well, I mean, you could use it better, but we just do it that way, so exactly there's no justification. Yeah, so the per capita use is like huge, of land. So it's not the wisest use of land by any stretch. So nowadays, therefore, nowadays the wisdom is that we need to build more densely in cities. So even in like the most sprawling countries of the world, you are seeing moves towards like infill development using vacant lots densifying, changing the zoning codes and all to allow more dense development to happen. You can see that happening somewhere now. That's why you have those towers where the students live, instead of the cost of land being like 10 kilometers away, you know. That sort of thing, right? Yeah, Dave.
You give a lot of examples, and you pointed out, about Punjab where they didn't take into account the poor. Are there any examples of city planning where they took into account the poor? No.
No, I mean, bluntly saying, no.
No, I mean,
Yeah,
it's
no,
interesting,
no, so
it's good to know that because it's kind of like.
No, what I'm saying is, okay, there were some countries and many countries, so where they built housing, for example, right? Now, if you leave it to the market forces, for instance, right? So you understand this, if you leave it to the market forces, why would the market create housing for the poorest people? Where you are going to get the small, so if you leave it to the market forces, if you're a developer who has the capacity, you will try to make the maximum bang with your buck, right? So you, if you can, you would build luxury houses. Everyone would try to build Papu Bono apartments. Because that is the maximum.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the thing, right? So, but then there's a market for other things, but. So you can do other things, so you don't have to, if you build the fewest number of apartments, get the most profit. Or you can do many projects, so you can go down market, you can down the price ladder. And you can build for the middle class, for example, or the upper middle class. So now you are making it up in the numbers, economies of scale. Many more people are in that segment, so the demand is higher, they'll do, right? But if you build it for lower end, because that's why lower, because it's also not their fault, it's not they want to do it just because they don't want to build, it is not profitable because land is so expensive, right? Land is the same price. Whether you want to build for, luxury apartments or you want to build low income housing, the urban land is the same price for everyone in any neighborhood, right? So then if you have acquired, then it doesn't make sense. So that has to be then incentivized by the government somehow, right? It has to be made, so there are different tools and all, but they have their limitations. But in the developing countries, we haven't seen that sort of, it's either the government builds public housing or they don't build public housing. And increasingly in the last 15, 20 years, in most developing countries, most global south countries, especially in this part of developing Asia, there is very little that is done, right? I mean, even Indonesia is beginning to build, but not much, yeah.
Can I jump into that?
Yeah.
I was gonna go to the restroom, but I can show, I think I mentioned to you, there's a case study in New Delhi. New Delhi, because I know this because I work with partner organization in Delhi. So in New Delhi, you have a leprosy colony, slums, big, humongous. And then there were civil society organization, NGO helping the lepers, cleaning their wounds, blah, blah, blah. And then they found, a gatekeeper, boring perhaps terminology, a gatekeeper who is Padma, Madam Padma. She's like a daughter of some prime minister. Have you heard her? Padma something. So they partner, and she managed to get the government to donate the land legally and work with partners and donors to build 4 houses for the leprosy patients. So the leper colony, you have to visit when you're in Delhi. The leper colony were given 4 houses. And then they started to develop bigger, and then there were education, and then after 2 generations, the children are smarter, educated, they increase the level of income in the community. So I just have to say that because there is a case study, and you have to visit when you go to Delhi. I'll keep you in context.
So I'll just give you an example. So like, say, for example, India, even some other countries now, like even in Singapore and all the, so when they build new housing, for example, they require that you need to provide like what is called a servant's quarter. It was not even required like in many countries beforehand, but that is very little in a way because and in some cases you're also witnessing that you have to provide, so it would usually be a room with a unit, right? In some cases now they're building a separate, sort of a housing complex, much smaller units for the domestic help who would service the richer, apartments, right? But even that is very rare, get it? So if you look at the housing stock of how much is built for the lower income groups, or the poorest versus the rest, even when it is built, it is a very small percentage. And if you then look at the spatial, that's what I meant by spatial injustice and spatial inequity. Even when they're built, if they're not required to be built on site, then whatever is built is like way out there. That means you might have to commute 2 hours on a bus if there's a bus or there's no bus, those kinds of things. Then you're dependent on informal transportation. The formal transportation network doesn't reach. So spatial injustice like spatial planning. Where is the metro going, for example? Subway. Who does it serve? Get it? So, for example, I mean, in Jakarta, your first metro line is basically running on Jalan Sudirman or so. No, sorry, on Rasuna side, I think. I mean, so so the point. I mean, it's not a bad start, but is it really serving the people, right? Hopefully, in someday it will reach. So that's what I mean, right? So why does it happen? Because there is very little public engagement, participation, feedback, because the system continues to be very top down, right? So that is the injustice part of it, that the injustice, the burdens are borne most heavily by those who are the poorest and the most marginalized groups in society, right? Why? Because we plan and design in certain ways without thinking about them, in a way. That's the bottom line, basically, right? In a way. All right, you must be all right. Oh, Ernest, help.
I don't mean to keep us, unfortunately, this might be kind of a broader question, but I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that Sao Paulo has the highest helicopters per capita of any city. When you have an example like that, where you have a very specific, highly expensive and novel means of transporting a very small subset of the city, like helicopters need maintenance, they need hangars, they need parts, they need qualified staff or people at least to pilot them. How does the implementation of a brand new transportation system like that look in a city like Sao Paulo, when you've got so many, I'm sure, millions of poor people living there? Like, where does the much needed additional infrastructure get built when there's only a very small subset of the population using that service?
Oh, it's not the problem. So first of all, Sao Paulo might have been overtaken by somebody else now.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's all right.
This is 50 years back.
Yeah.
Information I have.
Yeah.
It could be, for instance, Moscow today.
Mhm,
It is
mhm.
very possible. Right?
Sure.
Or it could be one of these, it could be Mumbai.
New York City, for example, like in order to deal with traffic, there's
It won't be North America. That's
yeah, but Uber, for example, is piloting helicopter rides from Midtown to Uptown.
No,
So,
but the thing is, this is only used by like very rich individuals.
Mhm.
It's not like a huge number.
Okay,
Like,
okay.
Per capita, meaning, I mean, even if they have like 1,000 helicopters, that's
Sure.
a lot to like just, ferret around, some like top executives have.
Mhm,
So they have, so it's very interesting. Sao Paulo's line on top has lots of these.
little helipads. Okay, gotcha.
Right?
Understood.
It's for them.
Okay,
So it's a very private thing. It's not
Okay.
very big by city now.
sure.
It's just an anecdotal thing that what I'm trying to say is that if you're rich and powerful, you can find ways to evade all of this
Mhm.
and not even engage with the city, right? So the rest, sort of the common populace is left to deal with the mess on
yeah,
the ground. right?
totally.
And
Understood.
that is, and proportionally speaking, it is most difficult for people. So see, even today, think about this. Gojek and Grab, so cheap, right? For most people. There are still people who cannot use that. Right? There are still people who depend on the BEMO and the Angkor, right? Or on the buses, right? Even though it takes a long time, because they cannot afford 2-3 rides a day on Gojek, right? So even in Indonesia, although it's so cheap, we generally talk about it as having become so cheap and so affordable and so, but it's still not for everyone, right? That's the thing, right? So if you think of how much money is being invested in improving transportation systems, etc., you don't see much, right? So it's almost like, okay, now there is a private answer to this and that's good enough kind of thing, but it's not good enough actually for a lot of people, right? So this is that's the point. So if you think of those issues, right? Equity, justice, access, inclusion, so when we do spatial planning, we should always think about those issues, right? Whatever are we proposing, how is it going to affect the weakest sections of society? At least if it doesn't benefit them, it should not harm them, right? At a very minimum, that's something called the Pareto principle in a way, right? That do no harm, kind of thing, right? Anyway, I think we can continue the discussion later. Yeah. Thank you.
Applause for Pa Ashok first. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So we will have a coffee break after this, and we will move to the studio room. Yeah, so please you can bring all your stuff. We will have a group discussion in a studio room, and we have a coffee break in studio room. So maybe we only have like 15 minutes for coffee break. I think if enough. And after that, we will go back to going to the studio room. Thank you and see you. Thank you.